Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining wherever you are in the world. Myself, I'm Alan. I've got Catherine, our COO, and Graham. We're in Ottawa. Magnus Dalbach is in Stockholm, and then Nick, I think you're in San Francisco. Is that right?
Yep, in
So
San Francisco.
today's talk, we're going to be chatting about semantic layer versus metric layer. This really seems to be a super hot topic. Everywhere we turn on LinkedIn, every conference that we go to, and I actually just came from a conference here in Ottawa, the idea of single source of truth and putting data around or meaning around data is really, really hot. So I'm looking forward to a great conference or great conversation about this. So let me quickly introduce our panelists, and then the last one to introduce, I'll also introduce Graham. So we've got Nick Handel here. Nick, give a quick wave. If you can hear me, or you're frozen, I hope. There you go, you're waving, that's right. So Nick is Director of Product at DBT Labs. So Nick was previously co-founder and CEO of Transform. So this was a company that was acquired by DBT Labs. So in his early days, he was a data scientist at Airbnb. Nick learned that a lot of the businesses were continuing to track. They didn't have the same North Star metrics. So this idea of single source of truth was just not there. So this is what we're really talking about. We've got Magnus Dalbach. Magnus is Senior Director of Data and Platforms at Voi. He was the former head of data engineering at Telia. Magnus is also really advocating for this new approach of making data-driven decisions. And what he says is metrics are really at the core of running a data-driven business. However, most data teams continue to overlook this, and they're focusing more on the dashboards than metrics. So this is something that we've got to make sure that we change. And then we've got our very own Graham Watts. Graham is a senior software architect at Clipfolio. And I would honestly describe Graham as one of the very first thought leaders and metric experts in this space. Graham has worked on the entire Clipfolio power metrics, metrics layer and architecture. He was also one of the senior thinkers at IBM in the early days on, again, the business intelligence front. So he's been in this space for a long time and has really been a driving force behind building this first hybrid solution that we're going to be diving into today. So we're first going to hear from Graham. So we're going to go over this, the presentation. We then have 20 minutes where we have the questions for the panelists and a discussion with the panelists. And then jot down your questions, either save them and voice them, unmute yourself and ask them in the last 20 minutes, or contribute them via the chat. So we'll get to those as well. All right, so I think without further ado, we've got a good crowd here. I'm going to hand it over to Graham, and we're going to get started for the first 20-minute discussion and presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alan. Since you gave such a great introduction, I'll skip the introduction slides. You covered all of that. The business intelligence. What is business intelligence? Well, business intelligence is all of the tools that you'd use in an organization in order to consume and make use of data in your day-to-day operations. In the last few decades, there's been significant investment from businesses around business intelligence, and it's sort of business intelligence promises to make big data feel small and manageable and consumable and usable. But it's not meeting that promise. And we know that because a number of studies have shown that many of the users in businesses who have business intelligence software available to them, they're not using it. They're going back to spreadsheets and other more traditional data tools, despite the challenges that they have with those tools. When we dig into that, we find that there's really two big themes as to why they're struggling with business intelligence. And that's that it's too hard, it's too much work, and they don't necessarily trust the numbers they're seeing out of the tools. We also find that business users tend to think of their data in more abstract terms than the raw data. Often in terms of KPIs that are the types of things you see on a balance sheet or other company reports, things like revenue and profit and expenses. And they make decisions based on these more abstract concepts, but they're not represented that way in BI tools. So what is a metric? A metric is a new type of BI artifact that we're starting to see. It's a quantifiable value that has real business meaning, which tracks its changes over time, and it builds in basic BI capabilities such as dimensionality and filtering. This is the marketing definition of a metric, but I wanted to talk a bit about a more technical definition of what a metric is. And from a technical point of view, I see a metric as having three main properties as a BI artifact. The first is that it has that single meaning, but it encapsulates all of the data query and data selection choices required to capture that meaning within the metric. So it's not exposed to the end user. And that includes things like the formulas used, how values are summarized, which values, data joins, and all that kind of thing is built into the metric. What it does expose to the user are choices around context of how you would get those values back and for what contexts. An example would be if you had a revenue metric, there's nothing you could do to the query of the metric that would give you a different meaning. You'd always get revenue values, but you could ask for values for different time periods, for different geographies, for different products, because those are different contexts, and they would still be revenue just for those contexts. Now, you may be thinking, well, you can capture all that in a report in existing BI tools, but reports capture the presentation and the usage of that as well, and that's built in. So the metric is a data artifact, is a pure data artifact. It doesn't enforce any kind of consumption of that data. And it can be used in multiple reports or multiple different tools that you're consuming the data in. So why does this matter? Well, if you look at the roles in a business around data, they typically break down into two primary roles. You have the data teams and the data experts that are managing the data and making it available to the rest of the business. And then you have everybody who's using data in their day-to-day jobs to make decisions. With traditional BI, the data engineers and the data team will be creating BI data models and so on, and they would love to be able to send those models to the business users so they can create the reports and dashboards and all of the other artifacts they need to make their decisions. But in order to do that, they need to understand their data at a fundamental level to make the right choices in that data, which is where we get to the existing BI being too hard for many users. They also So what they end up doing is they end up sending that back to the data engineers to build reports and dashboards, which isn't very efficient for either the data engineers or the business users. And they can't make the decisions as quickly as they'd like. With metric-centric BI, the data engineers are managing the metrics. The meaning is very clearly defined. The things you can do with the metrics are very clearly enforced. So you can self-serve, you can use them in visualizations quite easily as a consumer, and you understand the data you're getting and you can trust it. Here's a quick example of a typical query that you could do on a metric. In this query, we have a range of time, the current month. We've broken that time down into days. We've grouped by the products. In this case, in this sample data that's been returned in this visualization, there's 2 products, which is why there's 2 lines. And we filtered on a location, Brooklyn. And there's nothing you can do to that query to change the meaning, but you still have a lot of control over what data you're going to get from that specific metric. And what you get back is a data point for each unique context. So in this case, you get back a data point for each product in each day. So the first technical solution I'll talk about is the one we built at Clipfolio, which we called the metrics layer. I'll talk about the semantic layer next. So the metrics layer, we were focused primarily on the use cases around small businesses. Small businesses don't tend to have data managed in data warehouses. They tend to be using data that's in files like spreadsheets and common web services, things like Google Analytics, QuickBooks Online, and they're extracting the data from there to make use of it. So to use metrics, they needed to have data stored for their metrics. So we built a solution that stores the data for them, has a service, in a proprietary metric storage that is optimized specifically for metrics. All metrics get stored in the same way within the storage, and it's optimized for metric querying. If you wanted to create a metric, your own customized metric, you would need to configure a data ingestion that transforms the data from the source into the structure it needs to be to store it in the metric. In our case, it's quite simple. It's a table of data where there's a single value column for the metric values, any dimension columns you need, and a time column. Because we understand the APIs involved in many common cases, and there's a common set of well-known metrics, we're able to also template many of these. So people who don't want to go through the data ingestion and want to use a common known metric on a common service, they can just use a template and with a few clicks get some metrics that they can use immediately. But there's a few more things that need to be configured within the metrics in order to properly understand the meaning and be able to surface the values correctly on a query. The first are settings around how the metric history is built up over time. So the configuration for querying and bringing data in, well, that is run on a regular basis in order to get new data and bring new data into the metric system. Sometimes the data that comes back has time, sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't have time information, we store the values at the point when they were queried and ingested into the metric. And that way, after multiple scheduled data ingestions, we're able to build up the history of the metric over time within the storage. If it did come back with time information, then we'd be getting a window of time for which we have values on that ingestion. Now, it's important in that case that that window of time is larger than the rate at which we're scheduling ingestions, so we have no gaps in the history that we're building up in the metric. But what that means is we'll end up with overlaps, which we need to apply a reconciliation strategy to make sure we don't double count and so on. And then once all the values are properly built up in the history of the metric, there's still a couple of other very important settings that we need to understand for the meaning of the metric and the data in the metric. The first is whether the values coming in represent new values for the metric and replace the old ones, or whether they're just new values that get added to the existing values in the metrics. So you need to be able to set that option. There's also how the values that are being considered for any data point when we're summarizing, how those are aggregated. And there's a few different ways they can be aggregated. You could sum them, you could average them, min, max, count. As long as it transforms a number of data points into a single value that can be returned for that context, then it can be applied as an aggregation. So this is very important to the meaning of the metric. And an example I can give is if the data in the metric is a number of sales numbers for sales transactions, if you summed those values for, let's say, a week, the data point represents a week, that could be your overall sales revenue. If you averaged it, it could be your average sale amount. Or if you counted them, it's your number of sales for the week. Each of those would use the same data, but represent a very different meaning in terms of the metric and what it means to the business. So it would be a different metric. Now, where the metric layer isn't necessarily an ideal solution is when your data is in a data warehouse. And the reason for that is twofold. In order to bring it into the metric layer that I talked about, you would need to define usually fairly involved SQL in order to convert it to a format that's consumable for the metric layer. But also, you'd be duplicating data in two parts of your data stack, which when you're trying to manage a single version of the truth, is something that... So in the last couple of years, there's been another technology stack that has come about that supports metrics, which is a semantic layer approach. And the semantic layer differs from what I talked about in the metrics layer in a few different ways. One of the main ones being that the data is not stored in the semantic layer itself. It stays in the data warehouse. So when you query a metric that's defined in the semantic layer, it's a virtual data object, and the query is ultimately grabbing the data from the data warehouse. A little bit more depth of how that happens. So this is sort of a natural extension to what's called an ELT approach to building a data warehouse. In an ELT entity load transform, it's different from a traditional ETL approach. In an ETL approach, you would set the schema for your data warehouse and you'd be ingesting into that schema and querying from that schema. In an ELT approach, you bring all your data in raw tables or whatever format makes sense for that data. And you do that on a regular basis. And you apply scheduled transformations to the raw data to create optimized transform tables that have simpler queries. They're easier to manage, they're more efficient, and they're just easier to consume for the downstream applications. But that's still not in an ideal format for business users to be able to use. It's still SQL, it's still against a database. So an extra layer of metadata is added on top in the semantic layer. And this metadata takes the form of what are called semantics, so things like entities, measures and dimensions that describe both the transform tables and elements fields within the transform tables. This is described in language that is almost natural language, much the way that you would describe objects when you're defining an objects in an object-oriented architecture, by encapsulating all of that complexity behind kind of that natural language meaning. And on top of the semantics, there's also a number of metrics defined, which are those virtual queryable objects that capture that business meaning. Now, often where the metrics are stored in the semantic layer is also called the metrics layer. But for the purposes of this talk, when I refer to metrics layer, I'm talking about the other approach that we talked about before. When a metrics query comes into the system, what happens is that there's a query generation piece that will take the semantics in the metric query and create the SQL query that goes directly against the data warehouse in order to get the results for the metrics query and returns that. Here's some examples of the configuration of semantics and metrics in the semantic layer. This is taken directly from the DBT examples of metrics in the DBT semantic layer. On the left, we see that there's some of the semantic information defined, the entities, dimensions, and measures. There's descriptions and tagging that are really defining those pieces of data in the transform table. And on the right, there's metrics, which have that business meaning, refer to the semantics, and also have some extra transformations on top to appropriately format the data for the business meaning. You can create much more sophisticated metrics using this approach than the metrics layer approach I talked about before, but it is specific to the data warehouse. I like to think of metrics as recipes for business data, and the semantics has sort of the ingredients that go into those recipes. Now, what's interesting is regardless of what layer the metrics come from, these metrics work in almost the same way. They both have a concept of time, a grouping on time. They have dimensions for segmentation filtering. They both return summarized values for each context specified in their queries. They have clearly defined business purposes. They both have a query language that's optimized specifically for metrics, and that only allows you to specify safe context choices. It's almost like with gas cars and electric cars. They both drive the same way, but if you look under the hood, they work completely differently. But much like with cars, there's also a hybrid approach that gives you some of the benefits of both. Now, the hybrid approach is really a complete metrics platform that is able to integrate with both types of layers and consolidate your metrics in one place and be able to use them together in analysis tools and so on. Now, this has a few advantages, one being that you have a metrics catalog where you can see all the metrics for your business, and you can certify the ones that are important to your business, and you really get a sense of how your business is doing at a glance. But where it really gets interesting is when you start combining these metrics, and there's two ways you can combine them. The first is in a visualization, which could be a report or a dashboard widget or so on. And the way that you would do that is you'd specify context query for the visualization as a whole, and you'd assign the metrics to the visualization, and those metrics kind of can fit together using that context query. They can fit together almost like data Lego blocks. So it's a lot easier to build the visualization than it would be from choosing raw data elements in a more traditional sense. You can also create the same level of sophistication of visualizations that you could using traditional BI. You just may need mini metrics to do it. You can also create new metrics using calculation, and we call these calculated metrics. Those calculated metrics would have a name and a definition, business definition, like any other metric. But the configuration would consist of just a formula where the operands in that formula are other metrics in the system, and they can be from either layer. A business user can do this quite easily as well, because if they know the formula, that's all they need to know, and they just need to have access to the metrics they're using in the formula. The way that this works at query time, in both cases, is that there is a common metric query that is sent to all the metrics, to each of the individual metrics being used, either in the formula or in the visualization. And because it's the same context query, the results are going to come back with common context, the same columns for context. So a time will be grouped in the same way. Any of the dimensions requested will be coming back from both of the or all of the metrics being used. And then a join can be done on the results to line up the values of the metrics on those common contexts. So you end up with rows that are then lined up on that context. It can be sent directly to the visualization if you're visualizing it, and the visualization rules take over and plot the points. Or you can, if it's a calculated metric, then you create another column and you apply the formula to each of the rows individually to get the values for the calculated metric. So from that context query. So in that way, the calculated metric works just like any other metric in the system. So which type of stack would you use or should you use? Well, that really depends on where you are in your kind of data journey for your business. If you're a very small business and you have no data warehouse yet, but you want to get going with metrics and start with some of that metric discipline, then you can get going with the metric layer, maybe using some of those instant metrics so you can get going quickly. As you grow, at some point you're going to have unique data needs, and you're going to need to set things up in a data warehouse. You're going to need to have a data team, and you're going to need a semantic layer to support those metrics, and they'll likely be your official metrics. But you're still going to need to have quick metrics that you're prototyping, or metrics that are for personal use or analyses that you're trying that you're not going to necessarily want to go through the data team to create. And the metric layer is very useful for that. The hybrid solution allows both types of metrics to be used more or less interchangeably. As you grow even further, you become an enterprise, you have different departments, you have a larger data warehouse, a bigger data team, a lot more official metrics in the semantic layer. You're still going to have department level needs and things that you're not necessarily going to want to go through the data team, at least not at first. And the metric layer is still very useful for that as well. So the hybrid approach gives you the ability to kind of work with both layers interchangeably and to change between them as you need. Thank you. Here are a couple of other resources if you want to learn more. There's the Metric Stack newsletter where we have a lot of great information about metrics. And here's the website for the Klipfolio Parametrics product if you're interested in that.
Awesome, Graham. That's great. Thanks so much. So I'm going to open up with a few questions for Magnus and for Nick. So let's actually just take it up a level. And again, I don't know where everybody is at in the metrics and semantics journey as far as the audience goes here. So also, by the way, make sure that you're recording your questions or jotting them down in the chat. We'll have time to get to all of your questions at the end of this like little discussion period. And I want to leave enough room to make that happen as well. So listen, first question, and I'll open it up to Nick or Magnus. Like, why all of a sudden metrics, and why now? Why is semantics hot? Why is metrics hot? Like, there's definitely been a surge of interest. What is your opinion on why it's happening?
I can make
Magnus,
a start.
why don't you go first?
Yeah, I can make a start. No, I think what you said in the beginning, I mean, the kind of challenges that many companies have seen the recent years in like a constant loop of incoming requests and questions to the data teams, like where can I find this data? Okay, I found it. What does it mean? How should I interpret it? Okay, why does it look different there from there? Okay, can you send me a link to a dashboard where maybe I can find what I need? Okay, it didn't contain what I need. Okay, can you get me a SQL query? So that kind of loop goes on and on and on. It's just drowning the data teams in work where that time we could spend on something that's definitely more value adding, like working closer to the business and deep problem solving. So I think that going this kind of semantic direction and making metrics as the kind of starting point for users instead of finding a dashboard or going raw into the data tables in your data warehouse, I think that will be a huge kind of unlock factor in having users basically being able to self-serve. As you said, metrics are kind of the way we speak in the business, right? We don't talk about dashboard names or table names. We talk about metrics. So why don't make that the kind of starting point for users?
Yeah, great. Nick, what do you think? Why is metrics, why are semantics all of a sudden a really hot topic?
I think it's, there's been a few different kind of hype cycles in the last 30, 40 years around semantics, right? And I think that it kind of comes from two places. And the first is just technology, right? We've shifted to a completely new world in big cloud data platforms and tight integrations between a bunch of different products, like the kind of modern data stack, or whatever you want to call the modern set of tools, is pretty different than the set of tools that companies used 10 years ago. And I think the other piece of this is just that, so there's kind of this technology piece, and then I think that there's this ebb and flow between the desire for flexibility and like really easy exploration of data, which the kinds of tools that really lean in there are tools that just show you a SQL terminal and let you run wild with a data warehouse. And then on the other side, really governed reporting and a polished self-service experience and whatnot. And so we've kind of ebbed and flowed between these two experiences. And I think the problem historically is just that we haven't found a good, healthy balance where the analyst who has a totally novel question can answer that question, and the exec who wants to see the same report every single day can reliably get those numbers in their exec dashboard and slides presented to them. And so I think that this current flow is towards semantics, it's towards governance, but I think that also kind of highlights maybe the challenge that we have in front of us right now, where we need to be able to satisfy that extremely flexible experience on top of these modern cloud data platforms, as well as providing this really great governance for people who need lockdown solid definitions for their metrics.
So let me just riff on kind of the use cases and locking things down and who's understanding the problem domain, because I'm certainly seeing that the data teams, business analysts and data engineers, they're understanding the ideas and the challenges and the constant ask for report after report after report. What do we need to do to educate the business side of this equation? Because I think they're frustrated as well because they don't trust the data, but they don't I don't know that they understand metrics and semantics yet. So how do we solve that? How do we get it into a pull situation?
I think it's just we need to show them how it could look like. I think users are so used to okay, this is how data looks like. Okay, I need to search for the dashboards. I need to sometimes go down and look at the raw data. But if we can just show them how a new world would look like with a well-designed semantic layer, good context on that, and also on top of that, more modern BI tools that are really kind of built natively to run on the semantic layer or metric layer. I think if we just show how that could look like, it will be much easier than talking around it, so to say. So seeing is believing in a way.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that nobody is, you can tell somebody about self-serve and it's almost like a frustrating word for data analysts at this point.
Yeah.
But every executive wants it. But you actually need to put an interface in front of them where they get to, go into a menu, select revenue, select, split by store, and then see a, graph of revenue by store. Like it's that simple. And then they'll, believe and see the opportunity. I mean, they know the opportunity is there. They just have to actually see the experience.
Yeah, 100%. So let's say you are a company that is currently using a traditional approach. you may have, you know, multiple different BI tools. You may have different reporting structures or reporting processes that are sending out reports that are, you know, locked down. You've got a data warehouse, and maybe you've got some messy data that doesn't live inside the data warehouse. How would, I mean, Graham laid out a framework, but what would your advice be to a company that is not yet thought about adopting the semantic layer? So they're understanding the benefits, but what is that, you know, what is the first step? How does that happen?
It's kind of that kind of journey we've been at Voi. Obviously started off with building up the data warehouse, and then we came to a situation that, okay, we don't have accuracy in some of our key metrics. What do we do? So the first thing we did, at least, was to not implement the semantic layer as a first thing, but rather start treating metrics as some kind of asset. Okay, what are our most 10, 20 most important metrics? Can we align on a definition of them? Who actually owns that definition? And have some kind of lightweight process around it, and publish, socialize the kind of metric catalog with those definitions, so people understand what those metric means. I think for us, at least, that has been a very good start, and now we're trying to take the next step and make that kind of experience much more frictionless by actually making that kind of metric catalog alive through a semantic layer. But yeah, my recommendation would be to start just focusing on metrics, have some process around it.
And Magnus, maybe I can stay with you for a second. So who would be the early beneficiaries of this new approach? Are you involving the business users right away, or are you trying to win over your analysts first, or the data scientists? Like what are the personas that are really winning?
Yeah. So for us, it was really team effort between the data teams, the data analysts, and the closest kind of business stakeholders for those metrics, sitting down together. Okay, number of rides, we're a shared micromobility company, right? So number of rides, how do we actually define that? And then go on to revenue and maybe some operational metrics, and work together with business, setting those definitions. And who's benefit from it? Everyone using those metrics, because then we can actually get consistency. And if we want to do changes to those metric definitions, we have kind of a way to do it.
Nick, I mean, this is what you guys are really focused on right now. I mean, you've got huge user base in dbt core. Semantic layer exists on the cloud. What is your best advice to folks that are starting to move to a semantic layer? How did they start? How do they become successful?
Yeah, so I think that I've seen a bunch of different companies that adopt semantic layers, and I think that ultimately it all kind of goes back to the experience that I first had when I adopted a semantic layer, and just I think that actually replicating that in some ways is the goal. And you know,
so
it was,
do what I did, and you'll be successful.
I mean, I think that it was, and I'm talking about back in 2014. I joined Airbnb, and we were working on this thing called the metrics repo, which later on became Minerva. But the application was just metrics for experimentation. So it was experimentation first, just because we had to calculate so many metrics for experimentation, and then later, integration with kind of all of the different consumption interfaces. But it started off with just, I was on the growth team, and I just defined the metrics that I needed for my team. And, I agree that companies need to consolidate all of their metric definitions and reach agreement between different teams. But in some ways, it was this forcing factor where I, did the metrics for my team, for my kind of localized part of the company, just started recreating the SQL that I was manually writing, correctly 97% of the time. And so, just taking those definitions, locking them down, putting them in a place where others could look at them and understand them. And then, from there, as other teams adopted this, we figured out the places where we were off, right? Like where two teams were calculating things differently. And I think that it was, there are some good parts and some bad parts about that, but I think that the good part that's worth highlighting is this kind of incremental approach of focusing on, finding a portion of the company that can adopt this tech, can like really lean into defining their metrics in a consolidated way, show what the best practices are, establish those, and then expand out to other teams who see the value, see what this team is getting out of it, and then if there are kind of common metrics that are defined differently, hopefully consolidating those. Ideally the company's North Star metrics are defined consistently already because they're already in an executive report and everyone's copying those definitions. But I feel like the problems tend to come in the 11th to the 50th most important metrics at a company. And those are the ones that are actually having real impact because people talk about them, they make decisions off of them, but they're not the ones that everyone knows the definition of.
Yeah, that's interesting. So let me just read out one of the questions that came in. It's related. So the preamble is, sounds like the reason to go to a semantic layer is governance and collaboration. So pretty strategic stuff. So big company stuff. So for this person, as somebody who isn't from a huge company, is there an analytical workload that a semantic layer can power that wouldn't be otherwise possible? So again, for a smaller company, does the semantic layer, and this is for everybody, for Graham, Nick, Magnus, is there something that the semantic layer is actually unlocking that previously was not possible?
Yeah.
Who wants to tackle it?
Please go on. I'm still thinking.
Yeah. So
okay, good question.
Yeah, that's I think that the way that I see even beyond governance and collaboration and just kind of working across people, I think that there's a productivity piece. Like when I talk about the value, I usually break it down into I like governance and collaboration in my mind are pretty similar. Sometimes I call it trust. Sometimes people talk about consistency. I think that one is very well understood in the semantic layer. But I think that there is this really big piece around productivity. And I really love the metric definitions are like recipes, right? And you're kind of your various facts and your dimensions are various ingredients, and you can combine them in whatever way you want. But I think that the semantic layer for the individual, like why would an individual adopt this, is basically just having a very clean and organized kitchen, right? You know where all of the different tools are, where all of the, your dairy's in this corner of the fridge, your grains are in this corner of the pantry. Like, it actually allows you to cook faster, right? It allows you to like be more organized. It allows you to, have the grains ready when the water's ready for them, whatever. And so I just see this as getting really organized so that you can be more productive. And like, what does that actually lead to? It leads to, I've got a metric and I'm splitting it by a dimension. And I could take that chunk of SQL and try and rewrite it to pull in this other table and, aggregate it by this other dimension. And maybe that takes me 30 minutes. But I had the thought 30 minutes ago that I should cut it by this other dimension. I should probably be able to, ask that question, get that data back within minutes and form another question, right? To lead to this like question and answer cycle that analysts need to be able to move fast and really dig to the bottom of the questions that their business users are asking of them.
I think also to add to that, I don't think fundamentally there's anything you can't do with either approach, either traditional BI or metrics that you can do with the other. But one of the big benefits with working with metrics is that you can work much more incrementally. So in traditional BI, when you create a data model and you need to add to it, well, then you have to worry about everything that's built off that data model and how are you going to affect that. Whereas a metric, you can build a metric one at a time. And a metric doesn't have to have any impact on other metrics. And if it does, then you can test those metrics much more easily than you can test all the downstream artifacts. So there's an efficiency to being able to work with metrics that you gain by going with a metrics-based approach.
Magnus, have
Yeah.
you had a time to think about your
Yeah,
answer?
no, I've been thinking and listening. Good stuff. No, I think maybe one more thing to add, like Nick, you're onto kind of being organized and structure. I think it's also, from a data team perspective, I think it forces you in a way to like think, okay, this metric, what are the needs around this metric? Okay, model my data. What is it users actually need, and kind of see, yeah, that kind of structure forces you to ask yourself those kind of questions, I think.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So it's a really good question, because I do think it's very fundamental to how you approach measuring your business. The entire idea of semantics is to put meaning behind something. And I don't know if for those that joined early, I just came from another conference and I gave a talk there. And one of the quotes that I used was actually from Socrates, who I joked was a MicroStrategy user or something like that. But he said, the beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms. I mean, that's pretty cool. It's a way of really thinking hard about how do you want to structure those ingredients and recipes so that you have something that I think you can be more efficient and more trustworthy with. So totally, I think it's a philosophical approach to this. So I had another related question. So this question was, is there anything that is possible, that hasn't been possible in traditional BI? But let me ask the other question: are there any roles, data team roles or data science roles, or scenarios where the semantic layer is actually, or metrics layer is not the right approach? Like, where do you want to actually have, what roles do you want to really just not expose to the semantic layer, and you want to expose them to raw stuff? Like, is there a divide where for this group, because of self-serve or governance, you need to do it, and for this group, no, it doesn't make any sense?
I don't see that on top of my mind. I think every consumer of metrics would benefit from this, even like in machine learning, data science workloads. Sure. There we also want the consistency, right? Because we're building those models out from the same metrics that we do BI on. So I think it's value for everyone, mainly perhaps for business users, but yeah. Also,
I kind of think about this as like the like hierarchy of needs, right? So at the foundation, it's like data collection, right? You don't need a semantic layer if you don't collect any data. And above that, data modeling and getting it organized and consistency and like all of the things that you can do with data that you collect. And so I think, I see a lot of really early stage companies that are thinking about their data stacks of the future. And I do think you can get a little too far ahead of yourself here. If you're just using your, production Postgres database and running queries against that still, like, you're in the very, very earliest days, then maybe you should, go out and talk to a cloud data platform and, move that data over and like actually get into a place where you can do analytics. So I think that there's kind of, places where it's too early. The other one that I can kind of think of is, if you're just getting started, even if you're in that ecosystem where you have really nice data, I think that you can, it does take some iteration to get to a place where you really have your metrics and dimensions ready to go. And so, I think an example is we just released the DBT semantic layer, right, into GA. And we're obviously using our own semantic layer now to measure the success of our semantic layer, which is awesome. But in the very earliest, days of it, we just got a bunch of data dumped, from all of the engineering work, and it was just easier to go in and manually write SQL for the like 2-3 people who knew about that data to figure out what are the metrics and dimensions that we need to measure. But that quickly becomes a problem when everyone else wants to consume it. And so I think that I think it's more about staging and knowing like, when is it at a level of maturity where it makes sense? And I think that level of maturity is much earlier than most people assume. But that's kind of the main one. There are other really hard things. Machine learning. It's like very hard to build on top of semantic layer.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, what I'm hearing is that really, as soon as you have multiple consumption endpoints, no matter what the role, being opinionated and being defined about your measures and dimensions and expressions, that benefits everybody. There's really very little reason, other than you're right at the very beginning of this journey. There's no reason why you wouldn't move to a model that is more defined and more opinionated. So let's see if there's any questions from the audience. I know that I've seen, one or two come in in the chat, but are there any other questions? You can either unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat as well. And maybe while we're waiting, just to interrupt me if there are. So Nick, you just mentioned ML. I know that with the semantic layer, like one of the driving factors around putting meaning behind data is this AI craze. And I shouldn't even call it a craze. Like it's big and it's real. Like what is everybody's thinking on, how is that driving kind of the evolution or the next chapter of kind of the semantic layer? How is AI going to influence it? What are the big use cases? Where do you guys get excited? And Nick, maybe I'll start with you on that.
Yeah.
Or
go ahead.
Or yeah. Magnus, whoever.
You can start, Nick.
Okay, I'll jump in. So we have a few things that we are tracking on our roadmap. Ultimately the semantic layer is encapsulating all of this. It's it's like a linguistic mapping of an understanding of like all of the data that exists in a warehouse, right? It gives meaning to all of the underlying, columns and rows. And so, I said linguistics. I think that is actually, one of the things that these generative models are really, really amazing at. And so the way that I see it, there are kind of like three really big opportunities that I see right in front of us. The first is taking SQL queries, taking tables, and actually making it much easier to define metrics, right? So just looking at the information and creating that semantic model, that metric definition based off of the query for you. And maybe it's only 90% right, and you have to come in and edit it to make sure that it's exactly how you define revenue. I think the next one is, okay, great. I want to ask in natural language to formulate these queries. Like show me revenue by store, by day. Obviously, you could go and you could write, a query through a JDBC interface or a CLI or a GraphQL interface, but that's not what people really want, right? They just want to type some text and see some data. And so that is how you ask questions. I think that one is extremely doable. And the semantic model just makes it so that, what actually gets generated, the SQL against the warehouse, is the right definition of the metric. So when I ask for revenue, it's not like some AI model saying like, oh, well, I think this is probably how revenue would be, written in SQL. That's actually your definition of revenue. And that's really, really important. It means that the only error comes from mapping the question to the query. There's no error from the semantic layer query to the output. And then the last one is like data summarization. So being able to ask a question, what is revenue by store by day, and then actually have like a summary come back to you. And so now you're actually going language to language, which I think is a really interesting, future that I get excited about.
Yeah, for sure. Magnus, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, completely agree with you. And like what we've been trying to do at Voi during this year is more the second part there. Okay, can we find a way of users to ask a question in natural language and on top of a semantic layer get the accuracy that we need. And you get very, very far with just having a semantic layer on top of your raw data, because question like this, how many active writers did we have in this country last month? Okay, what is a active writer? If you just look at raw data, there's no way an AI could figure that out. Maybe it's hard enough for us humans, right? But with the context you get from the semantic layer, you actually define that as a concept, right? Same with what's last month, what's active, what's a writer. So all of that context baked into the semantic layer, I mean, gets you from basically impossible to use AI on or Gen AI on raw data to actually get maybe 80-90% accuracy, and hopefully it will be even better soon.
Graham,
And
what are
the
your
semantic
thoughts
layer
on
is the
the?
trick.
Yeah, for sure. Graham, what are your thoughts on the intersection of AI and the semantic layer?
I think both Nick and Magnus captured it very well. And where AI has always struggled is around understanding the data. And when the data is not clear, and it's not clear to humans, AI isn't going to be able to understand it and often returns some very, very embarrassing results. And we've all seen funny examples of that. But with metrics, because of that enforced contract we talked about, clarity of context and the metrics query, it becomes much easier for an AI to understand the data as well and give good results.
So we just got a question coming in on this topic as well. So let me just read it out. So interesting about natural language, AI to introduce the query. How would you power the knowledge for this AI? You'd need data viz across your data, not only DBT. So how would it work upstream and downstream? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that like DBT is infrastructure and is backend to support this. Like it's useless unless people build on top of it. So we need BI, we need companies that are thinking ahead and actually building around these building around the like potential of the semantic layer.
Well, and I think that's a great question. It really comes down to how you would actually respond to a natural language question from a metric. And I mean, it's fairly simple to map the natural language to a metric query when everything is clear. But the results of that query need to be formulated in some way that makes sense and a user can consume. And that's where the visualization comes in. Usually there's some clue in the natural language about how that output should be formatted. Visualizations usually have a purpose. Line charts are used for looking at changes over time. You look at a pie chart for a breakdown or a tree map. So ideally, you can tease something from the natural language in order to give a good visualization, but it's also not hard to present a default visualization for a metric that is a good place to start and the user can dig into.
Well, it may not even be a viz output. I think there's actually huge opportunity for just natural language back to the user, very conversational. I mean, I think one of the other big trends that is happening is that these larger monolithic BI tools are just overwhelming for end users. So, can we have more of an interaction with metrics just via Slack or Teams? Can it happen in other channels that, are where the end users actually live? And I actually think this is where AI and natural language processing, and based on the foundation of good data in the warehouse and a semantic layer, I think this is where it all comes together. So I think there's a super cool future. Any last thoughts? So we're going to wrap it up. Any last questions? Get them in like in the next second or two. Any last thoughts on kind of the future of semantic layer? Is there something that actually either you guys wanted to ask one another, or is there something that you think is really interesting for the future, or a nugget of advice to leave with this crowd?
Yeah, I think just
who are we gonna start with?
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously a lot of companies are. I mean, to be honest, quite new to this. If you weren't around like 15 years ago and worked with business objects or Cognos, whatever. But I mean, the way we're trying to do it now, at least, I still think there's like we're finding our way forward, and what will be the kind of big challenges or obstacles that the companies will face when trying to roll out the semantic layer for real. I think that's something I'm really interested to see how that paints out the coming years. And yeah, we're trying to find that way ourselves at the moment.
Yeah, so we'll do another webinar in 6 months.
Yeah, sure. Give you an update.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nick, what do you think? Any last words of advice?
One other thing that I'm just really excited about is the idea of being able to do this. Semantic layers create these really kind of interesting objects that we can attach information to. So one of the most powerful ones that I can think of is just anomalies and kind of annotations. And also forecasts. Like this information historically just exists in spreadsheets or floating around companies. But I get really excited about the day where we're actually not just pulling data in, but we're attaching meaning and important information to these objects and then surfacing them in visualizations. And so I think there's a really bright future even beyond just putting data in front of people, but it's actually like putting context and attaching that to these objects. So
yeah,
I'm excited about everything.
And remembering that context. Like I think I'm excited about annotations and using that as sort of metadata too, and just how that corporate history can actually be used and not forgotten, and then used to make better decisions, right? So Graham, before we get to you, I'm going to leave you with the last one, but we did have an interesting question come in here. So we've been chatting about the metric object, and the question here is, what about questions that are not related to metrics, but require a well-defined business object? So I guess if I can rephrase, like in the graph or ontology of all of the things in the company, how do like well-defined business objects, not the company, how did they sort of play into this whole role?
For me, 100% relevant question. There's definitely value in that as well. However, I see it probably makes sense to start with metrics. Most of the demands from business users are related to metrics. So I think if you could kind of start with the kind of metric centered approach, I think you will get there faster. But definitely there's a possibility with the semantic layer to kind of cater for also non-metric related questions.
All right, Graham, over to you to give us your final thoughts on kind of the advice, future. What are you excited about?
Well, I'm excited about metrics. I'm definitely excited about how AI is going to be able to build on metrics. I think there's a whole toolbox of advanced analytics we haven't even explored that we can use because of the structure and context that's built into metrics to really add value that typically is very difficult for people to apply to data, that we're going to be able to expose on metrics. We're starting to see some of that, like the forecasting that Dick mentioned, but there is so much more. So I think we're just getting going on metrics in this space in BI.
Okay, amazing. I want to thank all of you, Magnus, Graham, Nick, for joining. I think the takeaway is this is still really early days. I mean, as you said, Nick, you guys just announced general availability of the semantic layer in the cloud. I mean, these are early days. At Voice, you guys are just experimenting with, bringing the value out from all your structured data up to the business users. So there's still decisions and fine tuning to be made. And likewise, I mean, even though we've been thinking about metrics and semantics for a long time, it really feels like the world is just waking up to it now. And I think part of that is that AI is giving it a huge push, but I think people are really realizing that the traditional way of looking at data and trusting data is just broken. It's not working. So how do we really unlock that value for the business end users, so that they can make better decisions? All right, wonderful. So we have made a recording of this. I'm not sure how we're going to publish that. If we are, we've shared a few links here. you can look up all of us on LinkedIn, of course, and obviously DBT as a company, Voice as a private company, Clipfolio, us as a metrics catalog layer. So thanks again for joining. Nick, Graham, Magnus, thanks as well for joining as well. Okay, thanks everyone.